Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host. You may know me from Warm Pages. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. What's the weather like where you are tonight? And do you have a little evening ritual that helps you unwind? Share it with us. I truly enjoy reading your comments. And don't forget to subscribe. Now settle in. Our story begins. Chapter 1. A Call in the Snow. Snow was falling on Loch Dubh, transforming the Highland village into something resembling a Christmas card, thought Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, as he stood at the window of the police station with a mug of tea in his long hand. His dog Lugs, a mongrel of indeterminate ancestry with fringed ears that gave him a permanently worried expression, lay sprawled before the peat fire, snoring gently. It was Christmas Eve, and for once the village was behaving itself. No drunken brawls at the Loch Dubh Hotel, no domestic disturbances, no sheep wandering onto the main road. Hamish was grateful for it. He had no desire to spend Christmas Day filling out paperwork or, worse yet, attracting the attention of his superiors in Strathbane, with some incident that might result in his promotion and transfer away from this peaceful place he loved. The cottages along the waterfront glowed with warm light, their windows decorated with paper chains and tinsel. Hamish could see the faint outline of the church at the far end of the village, where Reverend McFie would be premiering for the midnight service. Even Mrs. Wellington, the minister's formidable wife, seemed to have temporarily suspended her campaign to organise everyone and everything within a 50-mile radius. Hamish finished his tea and was contemplating an early night when the phone rang. He glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. 9:30. Too early for any serious trouble, he hoped. "Loch Dubh Police," he said into the receiver. "Hamish, you had better come quick." The voice belonged to Douglas Kerr, a retired civil servant who lived in one of the cottages near the shore. Douglas was usually the calmest man in Loch Dubh, not given to dramatics. The urgency in his voice made Hamish straighten up. "What's happened, Douglas?" "It's Helen Forbes. I think she's dead." Helen Forbes was a retired schoolteacher, a woman in her late 70s who had taught generations of Loch Dubh children. She had a tongue like a razor and a memory like a steel trap, which made her both respected and, truth be told, rather feared in the village. "I'll be right there," Hamish said. He grabbed his peaked cap and uniform jacket, much to Lugs's dismay. The dog opened one eye and gave him a reproachful look. "Stay," Hamish commanded. "This is police business." Lug sighed heavily and closed his eye again. The snow had eased to occasional flurries as Hamish made his way down the waterfront. His breath formed white clouds in the cold air. The temperature had dropped sharply after sunset, and the snow squeaked beneath his boots. He passed the Napoli, the Italian restaurant run by Woolly's nephew, where cheerful voices and the scent of garlic drifted out into the night. Helen Forbes's cottage was one of the older ones, a whitewashed stone building with a slate roof and a red door. The door stood open now, spilling light across the snowy path. Douglas Kerr waited outside, a plate of mince pies in his hands, looking shaken but composed. "I brought these for Helen," Douglas said, gesturing with the plate. "Something I do every Christmas Eve. Take round some of my baking to the neighbours. The door was unlocked, so I called out and went in." He paused, swallowing hard. "She's at the bottom of the stairs." Hamish stepped inside, careful not to disturb anything. The cottage was neat and warm, with a small Christmas tree in the front window decorated with old-fashioned glass ornaments. A fire burned low in the grate. The telephone sat on a small table near the door, its receiver slightly askew in its cradle. Helen Forbes lay at the foot of the narrow wooden staircase, her body crumpled at an impossible angle. She wore a thick cardigan and wool skirt, slippers on her feet. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. Hamish didn't need to check for a pulse to know she was dead, but he did anyway, kneeling beside her and gently touching her neck. Her skin was still slightly warm. "How long ago did you find her?" Hamish asked, standing up. "No more than 10 minutes. I called you straight away." Hamish looked up the steep staircase. The wooden steps were worn smooth with age. A fall from the top would certainly be serious for a woman of Helen's age. but something nagged at him, the telephone perhaps, or the expression on Helen's face which seemed more surprised than frightened. "Did you touch anything, Douglas?" "No. Well, I checked her pulse, of course, but otherwise no." "Was anyone else about when you arrived?" "Not a soul. Most folk are at home, I expect, getting ready for the service later." Hamish pulled out his mobile phone and called to Jennifer Dalrymple, Loch Dubh's physician. Then he called the police station in Strathbane, knowing he would need to report this death and probably endure the presence of Detective Chief Inspector Blair, his nemesis, who would no doubt find some way to make a tragic accident into Hamish's fault. While they waited, Hamish studied the scene more carefully. Helen's walking stick leaned against the wall near the bottom of the stairs. An empty teacup sat on a side table in the living room. Everything appeared ordinary, except for the dead woman on the floor. "Did Helen seem herself lately?" Hamish asked Douglas. The older man frowned thoughtfully. "Now that you mention it, she seemed a bit on edge this past week or so. Distracted, you might say, not her usual sharp self. Any idea why?" "I couldn't say. Helen wasn't one to confide in people. She was more the type to judge than to share, if you know what I mean." Hamish did know. Helen Forbes had never married, had dedicated her life to teaching, and had maintained exacting standards that many former pupils still remembered with a mixture of respect and resentment. Dr. Dalrymple arrived first, brushing snow from her shoulders as she stepped into the cottage. She was a competent woman in her 40s who had moved to Loch Dubh from Glasgow several years earlier and had proved herself a valuable addition to the community. "Oh dear," she said, seeing Helen's body. "Poor soul." She conducted her examination while Hamish and Douglas stood back. After a few minutes she looked up. Broken neck. She would have died almost instantly, probably tripped and fell down the stairs. It happens to elderly people, especially on stairs like these. She gestured at the steep, narrow staircase. "Aye," Hamish said slowly. But he was thinking about the telephone, about Douglas's observation that Helen had been on edge, about that surprised expression frozen on the dead woman's face. Outside, car headlights cut through the falling snow. More people would arrive soon, and the peaceful Christmas Eve would dissolve into questions and procedures and paperwork. Hamish took one last look around the cottage, committing every detail to memory. Something wasn't quite right about this fall. He couldn't say what, not yet. But Hamish Macbeth had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and his instincts were telling him that Helen Forbes's death was not the simple accident it appeared to be. The snow continued to fall soft and silent, covering everything in white. Chapter 2. A Fall That Sounds Wrong. Jennifer Dalrymple returned to Helen Forbes's cottage early on Christmas morning, her medical bag in hand and a look of professional concern on her face. Hamish had called her at 7, asking if she could conduct a more thorough examination before the body was removed to Strathbane. "I didn't want to say anything last night with half the village gathering outside," Jennifer said, kneeling beside the body, which had been left undisturbed at Hamish's insistence. "And there's something here that bothers me." Hamish felt a flutter of vindication. His instincts had been correct after all. "What is it?" "Look at her left arm, just above the wrist." Jennifer carefully lifted Helen's cardigan sleeve. "These bruises. They're fresh, made peri-mortem, which means around the time of death. See the pattern? 4 marks here, one on the opposite side. That's consistent with someone gripping her arm quite firmly. Could she not have grabbed at the banister as she fell? Wrong angle, and the banister is smooth wood, wouldn't leave marks like this. No. Someone grabbed her arm with considerable force shortly before or during her fall." Jennifer sat back on her heels. "I'm not saying it's murder, mind you. Could be she argued with someone, they grabbed her, she pulled away and fell, but it wasn't a simple trip down the stairs." Hamish felt his peaceful Christmas dissolving like snow in sunshine. "Right. I'll need to speak with everyone who might have seen her yesterday evening." "There's something else," Jennifer added. "When I examined her throat last night, I thought I detected slight bruising, but the light wasn't good. Now I can see it clearly. Someone had their hands on her throat at some point yesterday. though not with enough force to strangle, more like a grab during a struggle. After Jennifer left, Hamish stood in Helen's cottage and surveyed the scene with fresh eyes. The telephone still bothered him. He picked up the receiver and pressed the redial button. It rang 3 times before an automated voice informed him the number was not in service. Dead end there, then. He searched the cottage methodically. Helen's bedroom was tidy, the bed made with hospital corners that spoke of her school-teacher discipline. Her wardrobe contained sensible clothes in muted colours. No secrets hidden under the mattress or in the drawers. Downstairs he examined her small desk in the corner of the living room. Bills paid on time, correspondence neatly filed. A diary for the current year sat beside the telephone. Hamish flipped through it. Helen's handwriting was precise, her entries brief. Doctor's appointments, meetings of the Women's Rural Institute, reminders about birthdays. Then 2 weeks ago, a single word, calls. The following week, calls again, more persistent. And 3 days ago, must settle this before Christmas. Hamish was copying these entries into his notebook when Douglas Kerr appeared at the door, looking weary. Despite the early hour, he was dressed in pressed trousers and a wool jumper, every inch the tidy civil servant, even in retirement. "I saw Dr. Dalrymple leaving," Douglas said. "Is everything all right?" "Come in, Douglas. I need to ask you a few questions." They sat in Helen's living room, an odd intimacy in the act of sitting in a dead woman's chairs. Hamish noticed Douglas glancing around the room as if memorising it. "You said last night that Helen seemed on edge lately," Hamish began. "Did she mention receiving any phone calls that upset her?" Douglas frowned, considering. "Now that you ask, yes. About a fortnight ago I was passing her cottage around tea time and heard her shouting into the telephone. Most unlike Helen, she was usually so controlled. When I saw her the next day she looked tired and drawn. I asked if everything was all right, and she said she was dealing with nuisance calls." "Did she say who was calling?" "No. I suggested she contact the telephone company, but she waved it off, said she'd handle it herself. That was typical Helen, never wanting help from anyone." "What exactly did you hear her shouting?" Douglas shifted in his chair. "I didn't want to eavesdrop, you understand, but I heard her say something like, 'I know it's you, and you won't frighten me.' Then she must have hung up because it went quiet." Hamish made notes. "Can you think of anyone who might have wanted to frighten Helen? Anyone she'd fallen out with recently?" "Helen Forbes fell out with people the way other folk breathe," Douglas said with a rueful smile. "She had exacting standards and no hesitation in expressing her disappointment when others failed to meet them. But most of the old feuds were just that. Old. Nothing worth threatening someone over." "Try me anyway," Douglas sighed. "Well, there's Ian MacLeod. His son Jamie was expelled from primary school years ago. Must be 15 years now. Helen claimed the boy had been stealing from other children's lunchboxes. Ian always believed his son was innocent. Said Helen had it in for the family." "Anyone else?" "Morag Sinclair. Helen publicly accused her of embezzling funds from the Christmas charity collection 5 years back. Turned out to be an accounting error, but the damage was done. Morag's reputation never quite recovered. And Ewan Fraser. He's the newest arrival, been here about 6 months. Came from somewhere down south. I heard Helen talk with his mother years ago, before she came to Lochdub. There might be some old connection there, but I don't know the details." Hamish studied Douglas carefully. The man seemed genuinely helpful, but there was something in his manner, a careful precision in how he offered information, that made Hamish's policeman's instincts prickle. "Where were you yesterday evening, Douglas? Before you came round with the mince pies?" If Douglas was offended by the question, he didn't show it. "At home baking. I always make mince pies on Christmas Eve, take them round to the elderly residents. It's something my late wife started, and I've kept up the tradition. I was alone the entire evening." "What time did you arrive here?" 9:15, give or take a few minutes. The pies had just cooled enough to transport." "And you didn't see or hear anything unusual? No one leaving the cottage? No sounds of an argument?" "Nothing. The village was quiet, everyone indoors keeping warm. If there had been a commotion, I would have noticed." After Douglas left, Hamish found Helen's answering machine, an older model with a cassette tape. He pressed play. 3 messages, all from the previous week. The first was from the Women's Rural Institute confirming a meeting. The second was from Dr. Dalrymple's surgery reminding Helen of an appointment. The third made Hamish lean closer. A voice electronically distorted, neither clearly male nor female. "You know what you did." Just those 5 words, then a click as the caller hung up. Hamish played it again, then once more. The distortion was deliberate, the kind achieved with a cheap voice changer device available in any electronic shop. But beneath the distortion, he thought he'd detected something. An accent, a particular cadence. It was impossible to say. He looked around the cottage again. Helen Forbes had lived here for over 40 years, had taught most of Lochdoub's current adult population, had kept her own counsel and her exacting standards. She had been frightened enough to save that message, troubled enough to write about the calls in her diary. The bruises on her arm and throat suggested a struggle. The timing of Douglas's arrival right after her death was convenient. Too convenient? Hamish shook his head. Douglas Kerr was one of the most respected men in Lochdoub, quiet and helpful, always ready to lend a hand. The man baked mince pies for his neighbours, for heaven's sake. Not exactly the profile of a killer. Still, Hamish had learned long ago that people were capable of surprising things when pushed far enough, and Helen Forbes had certainly been capable of pushing. Outside, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to Christmas morning service. Hamish locked up Helen's cottage and walked slowly back to the police station through the fresh snow. Lugs greeted him with enthusiasm, as if Hamish had been gone for days rather than hours. "Come on then," Hamish said, reaching for the dog's lead. "We've got people to talk to, and even on Christmas Day a policeman's work is never done." Lugs gave him a look that suggested this was a poor reflection on human nature in general, and Hamish's priorities in particular, but he trotted along obediently enough. The investigation, Hamish reflected, was only just beginning, and something told him it would be a long time before he got that peaceful Highland Christmas he'd been hoping for. Chapter 3 Voices from the Past. The day after Christmas found Hamish in the cramped records room of Lochdoub Primary School, surrounded by dusty filing cabinets and the ghosts of decades past. The headmistress, Mrs. Fiona Mackay, had grudgingly given him access after he'd explained the situation. Helen Forbes kept everything, Mrs. Mackay said, gesturing at the rows of files. Every report card, every disciplinary note, every parent conference summary from her 35 years of teaching. When she retired, she insisted on keeping copies of it all, said you never knew when the record might matter. Hamish sneezed. The room smelled of old paper and floor polish. Did she ever mention what she might do with all this? She talked about writing a history of the school someday, but I think she just liked having them. Helen was a woman who believed in documentation. Mrs. Mackay paused at the door. "I'll be in my office if you need anything. Please don't make a mess." After she left, Hamish began his search. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, but Helen's diary entry, "must settle this before Christmas," suggested unfinished business. An unfinished business with Helen Forbes likely involved her meticulous records. He found the file marked MacLeod James quite quickly. The boy had been expelled in January 15 years earlier for persistent theft from other children. Helen's notes were thorough, detailing 3 separate incidents where money had gone missing from lunchboxes, and a 4th where a valuable fountain pen had disappeared from another teacher's desk. But as Hamish read further, he noticed something odd. The handwriting changed partway through the final report. The first portion was in Helen's distinctive script, neat and controlled. The last paragraph, describing Jamie's confession and the decision to expel, was in the same hand but somehow different. The letters were formed the same way, but the pressure was heavier, the lines more emphatic. Hamish held the page up to the light. He was no expert in document analysis, but it looked to him as if that final paragraph had been added later, possibly traced or copied from Helen's other writing. The ink was slightly different too, now that he examined it closely. Had Helen falsified part of this record? He photographed the pages with his mobile phone and moved on. The files on other students were straightforward enough, filled with Helen's sharp observations and frank assessments. She had not been a teacher who offered easy praise or softened difficult truths. In another cabinet, he found a separate folder labelled Personal Correspondence. Inside were letters dating back decades. Hamish flipped through them, looking for anything from the past few months. Near the back, he found a letter dated 6 weeks earlier. It was typed, the signature illegible, but the content made him sit up straighter. "Miss Forbes," it began, "I have recently learned the truth about what you did to my mother. She spent the last years of her life in disgrace because of your lies. You may think time has erased your sin, but I have not forgotten, and I will not let you forget either. You will answer for what you did. No return address, no clear indication of who had sent it. But Helen had kept it, filed it away with all her other documentation." Hamish was photographing this letter when his mobile rang. It was Jessie Curry, the village gossip and owner of the general store, a woman whose twin accomplishments were repeating everything twice and knowing everyone's business. Hamish, I've just remembered something about Helen, Jessie said in her characteristic manner. "Can you come to the shop? 10 minutes later, Hamish stood in the cluttered warmth of Curry's stores while Jessie fussed with the kettle. Her shop smelled of soap powder and digestive biscuits, a combination Hamish had always found oddly comforting. "It was about 3 weeks ago, Jessie began, settling into her usual spot behind the counter. Helen came in for her weekly shopping, and she seemed distracted. Not herself at all. Did she say anything unusual? She was muttering to herself, something about setting the record straight before Christmas, I asked her what she meant, but she just gave me that look of hers, that look that you said, mind your own business. Did she seem frightened?" Jessie considered this, her head tilted like a curious bird. Not frightened exactly. More like determined. The way she used to look when she'd caught a child telling lies. After leaving the shop, Hamish walked down to the harbour where Archie McLean, the local fisherman, was mending his nets despite it being Boxing Day. Archie's wife kept him on such a tight leash that he often invented work simply to escape the house. "Archie, did you ever have dealings with Helen Forbes when you were a lad?" Archie's weathered face creased into a smile. "Aye, she taught me for 3 years. Terrifying woman she was. Made me learn my multiplication tables until I could recite them in my Zeep. Still can if you want to hear them." "Did she ever play favourites? Or single anyone out for harsh treatment?" "She was strict with everyone, but fair enough, I suppose, though—" Archie paused, his hand still working the nets. "There was that business with Ewan Fraser's mother. Before my time, this was, but folk talked about it for years after." "What business?" "Mrs. Fraser, she was called Eileen, taught with Helen back in the day. Got accused of having an improper relationship with a parent, a father of one of her students. Helen reported her to the education authorities. Mrs. Fraser lost her teaching certificate, had to leave the Highlands. The whole thing was hushed up, but everyone knew." "Was it true?" Archie shrugged. "Who can say? The man denied it, said Helen had misinterpreted an innocent conversation. But the damage was done. Mrs. Fraser's life was ruined it was. She died a few years back, never worked as a teacher again. And her son Ewan is here now in Lochdoub. Moved up from Edinburgh about 6 months ago. Says he wanted a quieter life, but I always thought the timing was odd indeed. Helen was still alive when he arrived, and he must have known she lived here." Hamish walked back toward the police station, his mind churning. The pattern was becoming clearer. Helen Forbes had wielded considerable power through her position and her documentation, and it seemed she had not always wielded it justly. But had someone finally decided to make her pay for past wrongs? Back at the station, he found a message on his answering machine. The voice was familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. "Constable Macbeth, this is Ewan Fraser. I understand you're investigating Helen Forbes' death. I think we should talk. I've been receiving phone calls too, the same kind Helen got. They only stopped when she died. Hamish saved the message and sat down heavily in his chair. Lugg, sensing his master's troubled thoughts, padded over and rested his head on Hamish's knee. "What do you make of it, boy?" Hamish asked, scratching behind the dog's fringed ears. "We've got threatening calls, old grudges, falsified records, and now another victim who's suddenly safe because the first one is dead." Luggs had no answers, but his presence was comforting nonetheless. Hamish pulled out the photographs he had taken of Helen's files and the threatening letter. The handwriting analysis would need to be done properly by experts in Strathbane, but his gut told him the Jamie MacLeod file had been tampered with, and if Helen had falsified that record, what others might she have altered? The threatening letter bothered him too. "I have recently learned the truth about what you did to my mother." That suggested someone young enough to have a mother whose career had been affected by Helen's actions. Ewan Fraser fit that profile perfectly. But why would Ewan call him voluntarily if he were guilty? Unless it was a clever double bluff, a way to appear cooperative while misdirecting suspicion. As twilight settled over Loch Dub, painting the loch in shades of purple and grey, Hamish made a list of everyone he needed to interview properly. Ian MacLeod, whose son's record had possibly been falsified. Morag Sinclair, publicly humiliated over the charity funds. Ewan Fraser, whose mother's life had been destroyed. And Douglas Kerr, helpful Douglas Kerr, who had found the honesty and seemed to know so much about everyone else's grievances with Helen. The telephone rang again. This time it was Detective Chief Inspector Blair from Strathbane, drunk as usual and bellowing about Hamish's failure to file proper reports. "It's Boxing Day, sir," Hamish said mildly. "Even criminals deserve a day off." "Don't you take that tone with me, Macbeth. I want a full report on my desk tomorrow morning, or you'll find yourself transferred to traffic duty in Glasgow." After Blair hung up, still muttering threats, Hamish allowed himself a slight smile. Blair had been threatening to transfer him for years, and it never happened. The man needed Hamish to solve cases so he could take the credit. Tomorrow he would interview his suspects properly. Tonight he would review everything he knew and try to see the pattern beneath the surface. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the village in a fresh layer of white. Somewhere in Loch Dub, someone who had grabbed Helen Forbes's arm and throat was sleeping peacefully, perhaps believing they had gotten away with murder. But Hamish Macbeth was patient, and he was thorough, and he would find the truth. It was after all what Helen Forbes herself would have demanded. Chapter 4. First suspects ring in. The morning after Boxing Day brought a break in the weather, though the cold remained fierce enough to make Hamish's breath visible as he walked up the hill toward Ian MacLeod's farm. Luggs bounded ahead through the snow, delighted to be out on an adventure rather than sprawled before the fire. Ian MacLeod was a large man who had grown larger with middle age, his face weathered from years of Highland farming. He answered the door in his shirt sleeves despite the cold, wiping his hands on a tea towel. "Constable Macbeth, I've been expecting you." They sat in the farmhouse kitchen, which smelled of bacon and strong tea. Ian's wife bustled about, offering refreshment that Hamish politely accepted. He had learned long ago that refusing Highland hospitality was a sure way to close mouths that might otherwise open. "It's about Helen Forbes, I expect," Ian said, settling his bulk into a chair that creaked under the weight. "Jessie Curry says you think it wasn't an accident." "Jessie Curry says a great deal," Hamish replied diplomatically. "I'm simply following up on some questions. I understand your son Jamie was expelled from school 15 years ago." Ian's jaw tightened. "Aye, he was. And it was an injustice, a terrible injustice. That woman decided my boy was a thief, and nothing would change her mind." "Was he guilty?" "No." The word came out flat and hard. "Jamie never stole anything in his life. We raised him right, raised him honest. But Helen Forbes had made up her mind, and once she'd done that, evidence didn't matter." "What makes you so certain?" Ian leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Because the stealing stopped after Jamie left, that's why. Went on for another month, it did. Turned out it was another lad entirely, caught red-handed eventually. But did Helen Forbes apologise? Did she offer to clear Jamie's name? Not a bit of it. Said the boy must have learned from Jamie's example. Hamish made notes. Did Jamie ever confront her about it? He tried once when he was older. She shut the door in his face, told him he was lucky she didn't report him for harassment. Ian's voice shook with suppressed anger. My boy's 30 now, doing well for himself down in Inverness, but he still carries the shame of it. Won't come back to Loch Dub because of what folk might remember. Where were you on Christmas Eve, Ian? Here at the farm with my wife and her sister, who was visiting from Dornoch. We had our dinner at 6, watched the television until at about 10, then went to bed. My wife will tell you the same. Mrs. MacLeod confirmed this from her position by the stove, her voice steady and sure. After leaving the farm, Hamish headed into the village to find Morag Sinclair. She lived in a neat cottage near the church, and when she opened the door, he saw a thin woman in her 60s with careful makeup and nervous hands. Mrs. Sinclair, need to ask you about Helen Forbes. Morag's face went pale. I had nothing to do with her death. I haven't spoken to that woman in 5 years. But you had reason to dislike her. They sat in her spotless living room, every surface dusted and arranged just so. Morag twisted a handkerchief in her lap as she spoke. Helen accused me of stealing from the Christmas charity fund, stood up at the Women's Rural Institute meeting and said the numbers didn't add up, implied I'd taken the money for myself. Her voice dropped to nearly a whisper. It was the worst moment of my life, everyone staring at me thinking I was a thief. But it was an accounting error. Yes, found the mistake 3 days later. The bank had processed a donation twice in their records. But Helen never publicly apologised, never stood up at the next meeting and said she'd been wrong. She just let people go on thinking I was dishonest. Did you ever confront her about it? Once, I went to her cottage and asked her to set things right. She said the truth would out eventually, and that I should be grateful she hadn't insisted on a police investigation. Morag's eyes filled with tears. I lost friends over that accusation. People still look at me sideways in the shops. Where were you on Christmas Eve? At my daughter's house in Brikey. Left here at 4 in the afternoon and didn't come back until yesterday morning. My daughter and her husband will confirm it. Hamish made his notes and moved on to his third interview of the day. Ewan Fraser lived in a rented cottage on the edge of the village, one of the newer buildings that lack the character of the older homes, but made up for it in modern conveniences. Ewan was a man in his early 40s with his mother's dark hair and an air of quiet intensity. He invited Hamish in without preamble. I'm glad you came. I wanted to explain about the phone calls. Go on. They sat in a living room that still had the bare, temporary feel of a recent arrival's home. Books were stacked in corners waiting for shelves. Pictures leaned against walls unhung. They started about 2 months ago, Ewan said. At first just silent calls, then heavy breathing, then that distorted voice saying horrible things, telling me I was worthless, that I'd never escape my mother's shame, that everyone knew what she'd done. What had she done? Ewan's face hardened. Nothing. My mother did absolutely nothing wrong. But Helen Forbes destroyed her anyway, accused her of having an affair with a parent. It was a complete fabrication, a vindictive lie told by a woman who couldn't stand anyone else getting attention or affection. Why would Helen do that? Because my mother was younger, prettier, more popular with the students. Because the father Helen accused her of having an affair with her had rebuffed Helen's own advances years earlier. Because Helen Forbes was a spiteful woman who used her position to punish anyone who threatened her or rejected her. Hamish absorbed this new information. You said the call stopped when Helen died. The very day. Not a single call since Christmas Eve. That's what made me realise the caller must have been connected to her somehow. Maybe even was Helen herself, though the voice was too distorted to tell. Did you come to Loch Dubh specifically because Helen was here? Ewan hesitated. Partly, I wanted to confront her, to make her admit what she had done to my mother. Mum died 3 years ago, never got over what happened. I thought if I could just get Helen to acknowledge the truth, it might bring some kind of closure. And did you confront her? I tried. Went to her cottage about a month after I moved here. She refused to talk about it, said my mother. Got what she deserved for being careless with her reputation. I may have raised my voice and she threatened to call the police. So I left. Where were you on Christmas Eve? Here, alone. I'm new to the village. Don't really know anyone yet. I had my dinner, read a book, went to bed early. No alibi, I'm afraid. As Hamish walked back toward the police station, his mind worked through the interviews. 3 people with strong motives to hate Helen Forbes. Ian's alibi seemed solid, backed by family members. Morag's could be checked easily enough. But Ewan Fraser alone on Christmas Eve with no one to vouch for his whereabouts and a mother whose destroyed career gave him powerful reason for revenge. Yet something didn't fit. If Ewan had been receiving threatening calls too, calls that stopped when Helen died, then who had been making them? Unless Ewan was lying about the calls, using them as a cover story. Hamish stopped at the Napoli for a late lunch, where Angela, the doctor's wife, was having tea with Priscilla Halberton Smythe, the local laird's daughter and Hamish's occasional romantic interest. "Hamish, you look troubled," Angela said. "Sit down and tell us about it. Or don't, if it's police business." He sat, and Priscilla poured him tea without being asked. Her cool blonde elegance was as restful as ever. "I'm investigating too many motives and not enough opportunity," he said carefully. Everyone had reason to dislike Helen Forbes, but proving who actually harmed her is another matter entirely. "Helen did leave a trail of damaged people behind her," Angela observed. "My husband says she was the kind of woman who believed being right justified any amount of cruelty in expressing it." "The trouble is," Hamish said slowly, "I keep thinking about Douglas Kerr. He found the body, he's been helpful with information, but something about his helpfulness bothers me. It's almost too perfect, too cooperative." Priscilla stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Douglas is one of the kindest men in the village. I can't imagine him hurting anyone." "Neither can I," Hamish admitted, "but I've been a policeman long enough to know that kind people can do terrible things when pushed beyond endurance." He finished his tea and headed back into the cold. Tomorrow he would dig deeper into Douglas Kerr's background, check the alibis more thoroughly, and try to make sense of the phone calls. Somewhere in this tangle of old grudges and new grievances lay the truth, and Hamish intended to find it, no matter how many respectable facades he had to peer behind. Chapter 5. Old Lessons, Old Grudges. Hamish spent the following morning at the police station in Strathbane, a building that always made him grateful for the peace of Lochdoop. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the air smelled of institutional cleaning products and bad coffee. Detective Sergeant Jimmy Anderson, one of the few officers at Strathbane Hamish could tolerate, had pulled the phone records and was spreading them across a scarred desk in the incident room. "Your victim received 17 calls from the same mobile number over the past 6 weeks, Jimmy said, tapping the papers, all short, under a minute each. Numbers registered to a pay-as-you-go phone bought at an electronics shop in Inverness. Cash transaction, no ID required." "Dead end, then?" "Not entirely. The phone was purchased on November 15th, the day before the first call to Helen Forbes. And get this, the shop's security cameras caught the buyer." Jimmy pulled up a grainy image on his computer. A figure in a dark coat and knit cap, face partially obscured by the angle, and a scarf wrapped high around the neck. Could have been male or female, young or old. The only clearer detail was a pair of glasses with dark frames. "Not much help," Hamish said. "There's more. The same phone called Ewan Fraser's number 6 times, starting 3 weeks ago. Last call to him was December 22nd, 2 days before Helen Forbes died." Hamish studied the records. So someone was tormenting both of them. Why stop calling Fraser before Helen died? Maybe the caller got what they wanted from Fraser. Or maybe Fraser's lying about the calls altogether. Hamish borrowed Jimmy's computer and spent an hour going through the case files on Helen Forbes's past complaints and disciplinary actions. The Jamie MacLeod file had been digitised years ago, and comparing it with Helen's other work showed clear inconsistencies in the final paragraph, just as he'd suspected. She definitely altered this record, Hamish said. Added the confession and recommendation for expulsion after the fact. Enough to prove she did it 15 years ago. Maybe not in court, but enough to convince me. And if she falsified one record, she might have done others. He found 3 more questionable files, all following the same pattern. Original disciplinary notes, in Helen's hand, followed by harsher conclusions that appeared to have been added later. In each case, the child involved had been expelled or transferred, their educational records permanently marked. The woman was a menace, Jimmy muttered. How did she get away with it? Because she was meticulous about everything else. Teachers trusted her documentation. Administrators relied on her judgment. Who would question someone so thorough, so professional? On his way out of Strathbane, Hamish stopped at the forensics lab where a technician named Moira was examining the evidence from Helen's cottage. The bruises on the victim's arm and throat are definitely defensive wounds, Moira said, showing him the photographs. Someone grabbed her during a struggle. The arm bruises suggest the attacker was right-handed, gripping with considerable force. Can you tell anything else about the attacker? Height's tricky, but based on the angle of the throat bruises and the victim's height of 5'4", I'd estimate the attacker was between 5'8" and 6 feet tall. Could be a tall woman or an average height man. Hamish thanked her and drove back to Lochdeub through afternoon sunshine that did nothing to warm the frozen landscape. He found Ian MacLeod's contact information for his son Jamie and called him in Inverness. Jamie MacLeod sounded wary when Hamish explained who he was, but his voice softened when the topic turned to Helen Forbes. I heard she died. Can't say I'm sorry about it, Jamie said bluntly. That woman ruined my childhood, even after they caught the real thief. She never admitted she'd been wrong about me. When did you learn she'd falsified the record? A pause. What do you mean? The confession she claimed you made. It was added to the file later, possibly forged. The silence stretched so long Hamish thought they'd been disconnected. Then Jamie spoke, his voice thick with emotion. All these years, my father insisted I'd never confessed. I thought maybe I had and blocked it out, the way children sometimes do with traumatic memories. You're telling me she made it up? It appears we. God. Another long pause. I need to tell my dad. He's carried the weight of thinking I lied to him all this time. After ending the call, Hamish sat in the Land Rover outside the police station, watching the loch darken as the sun dropped behind the mountains. The case was becoming clearer in some ways, murkier in others. Helen Forbes had been a woman who manipulated truth to suit her purposes, who destroyed lives and reputations without apparent remorse. But which of her victims had finally struck back? He found Morag Sinclair's daughter's number and called to verify the alibi. The daughter confirmed her mother had arrived in Breaky at 5 on Christmas Eve and stayed until Boxing Day morning. The time of death, according to Dr. Dalrymple, had been between 8:30 and 9:30. Morag was eliminated. Ian MacLeod's alibi held up as well. His sister-in-law from Dornoch confirmed spending Christmas Eve at the farm, playing cards until nearly midnight. That left Ewan Fraser, who had no alibi and a powerful motive. Hamish drove to Fraser's cottage and found him in his small garden, attempting to clear snow from a path. Mr. Fraser, I need to ask you some more questions. Ewan set down his shovel, his expression guarded. All right. You said you confronted Helen about your mother about a month after moving here. Did you contact her before that? Letters? Phone calls? I wrote to her twice before I moved, asked if we could meet and discuss what happened to my mother. She never replied. Do you wear glasses? The question clearly surprised him. Yes, when I'm reading. Why? May I see them? Ewan went inside and returned with a pair of reading glasses in thin wire frames. Nothing like the dark-framed glasses in the security footage from Inverness. Did you buy a mobile phone in Inverness in November? No, I've had the same phone for 3 years. You can check my records if you like. Hamish did right there, calling Fraser's mobile provider. The phone had indeed been registered 3 years earlier, and there were no recent purchases on the account. "You're eliminating me as a suspect," Ewan said, realization dawning. "You thought I might have made those calls myself, used them as a cover." "I have to consider all possibilities." "I understand, but I didn't kill Helen Forbes, Constable. I wanted her to admit what she'd done, to acknowledge my mother's innocence. I wanted an apology, not revenge. My mother wouldn't have wanted me to hurt anyone on her behalf." Back at the police station, Hamish fed Lugs and made himself a meal of tinned soup and bread, his mind churning through the evidence. 3 strong suspects, all with alibis or eliminating factors. The mysterious phone calls, the falsified records, the struggle that ended in Helen's death. And always, at the edge of his thoughts, Douglas Kerr. Helpful, cooperative, calm Douglas Kerr, who had found the body and been so useful in pointing toward other suspects. Hamish pulled out his notebook and wrote down everything he knew about Douglas. Retired civil servant, widower, lived alone, well liked in the village. His wife had died about 10 years ago, Hamish recalled. What were the circumstances? He made a call to the records office in Inverness requesting information on the death of Mrs. Elizabeth Kerr. Then he settled down to wait, watching the fire burn low while Lugs snored at his feet. Sometimes the answer to a mystery lay not in the obvious grudges and recent wounds, but in older, quieter griefs that had been buried too long. Hamish was beginning to suspect that Helen Forbes's death had roots that reached back further than anyone had yet considered. The phone rang just before 10. It was the records office, a clerk working late who had found what Hamish requested. Mrs. Elizabeth Kerr died by suicide in January 15 years ago. There was an inquiry. She'd been accused of child neglect in her position as a school dinner lady, reported by a teacher named Helen Forbes. The accusations were investigated and found to be false, but Mrs. Kerr had already taken an overdose of sleeping tablets. The inquiry concluded she'd been suffering from depression, exacerbated by the false accusations. Hamish thanked the clerk and hung up slowly. 15 years ago. The same time Jamie MacLeod had been expelled. The same time Helen Forbes had been at her most destructive, and Douglas Kerr had stayed in Lochdoub. All these years, quiet and helpful, never speaking ill of anyone, least of all Helen Forbes. Until Christmas Eve, perhaps, when old grief and new opportunity had finally converged. Chapter 6. False Connections. The next morning brought Detective Chief Inspector Blair to Lochdoub, along with a hangover and his usual complement of complaints. Hamish met him at the police station, where Blair immediately began cataloguing Hamish's supposed failures as an investigator. 4 days since the death, Macbeth, and what have you got? Nothing but a list of folk who didn't like the victim. Half the Highlands probably didn't like her, from what I hear. I'm pursuing a specific line of inquiry, sir. Well, pursue it faster. The press is starting to sniff around, asking questions about crime rates in Highland villages. Makes the force look bad when we can't solve a simple murder in a place where everyone knows everyone else's business. After Blair left, taking with him a bottle of whiskey from Hamish's private stock that he hadn't been offered, Hamish called Jimmy Anderson back in Strathbane. I need you to trace where that mobile phone has been used, Jimmy. Not just the calls it made, but where it was when those calls were made. I can get cell tower data. Give me a few hours. While he waited, Hamish walked down to the village hall, where Douglas Kerr was helping set up for the annual post-Christmas jumble sale. The older man looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, but his movements were as precise and organised as ever. Douglas, could we have a word? They stepped outside into the cold. Douglas pulled on his coat and gloves with methodical care. It's about your wife, isn't it? Douglas said quietly. I wondered when you'd get round to that. Tell me what happened. Douglas was silent for a long moment, staring out at the loch. When he spoke, his voice was measured, almost detached, as if he were discussing someone else's tragedy. Elizabeth was a school dinner lady, a simple job she loved because it meant she could work with children. She was a gentle soul, easily hurt. Helen Forbes reported her for neglect, claimed she'd seen Elizabeth give spoiled food to the children, deliberately endanger them. It was a complete fabrication. Why would Helen do that? Who knows? Perhaps Elizabeth had slighted her in some way I never knew about. Perhaps Helen simply enjoyed exercising her power. The accusations were investigated and dismissed, but by then the damage was done. Elizabeth couldn't bear the shame of it. The looks from other mothers, the whispers. She took an overdose of sleeping tablets 3 weeks after Helen made her report. I'm sorry. Are you? Douglas looked at him directly for the first time. Or are you calculating whether that gives me motive to murder Helen Forbes 15 years later? Both can be true. Douglas almost smiled. Yes, I suppose they can. You're more honest than most policemen, Hamish Macbeth. Did you confront Helen after your wife died? No. I attended the inquiry, heard them conclude that Helen's accusations had been unfounded, watched her sit there without a flicker of remorse on her face. I thought about confronting her then, but what would it have changed? Elizabeth was gone, and no amount of shouting would bring her back. Why did you stay in Lochdoub? Because this was our home. We'd been happy here. Leaving felt like letting Helen drive me away, like admitting defeat. So I stayed, and I kept my head down, and I never spoke of it to anyone. Hamish's mobile rang. It was Jimmy Anderson. I've got the cell tower data. That phone was used exclusively in the Lochdoub area. Always within a 3-mile radius of the village centre. Every single call. Can you narrow it down further? Not precisely assez, but the towers suggest whoever made those calls was operating from the eastern part of the village. The calls were all made in the evening between 7 and 9 o'clock. After ending the call, Hamish turned back to Douglas. Where do you live exactly? Rose Cottage, on the East Shore, you know that. And you were home alone every evening for the past 6 weeks. Yes, as I've told you before, I live alone. I cook my dinner, I read, I watch television occasionally. It's not an exciting life, but it's peaceful. Did Helen ever apologise to you? Try to make amends? Douglas's jaw tightened. Not once. I saw her around the village, of course. Impossible not to in a place this size. She never acknowledged me, never showed the slightest recognition that she'd destroyed my life. It was as if Elizabeth had never existed. Back at the station, Hamish spread out all his notes and tried to see the pattern. The phone calls had been made from Lochdoub, from the eastern part of the village where Douglas lived. But correlation wasn't proof. Other people lived in that area too. He made a list of all residents on the eastern shore. Douglas Kerr, old Angus McTavish, who was 90 if he was a day, the Frasers who ran the bakery, young Peter McScumby, Sween, who worked on the oil rigs and was rarely home, and 3 holiday cottages that were empty this time of year. His mobile rang again. This time it was Archie McLean, the fisherman. Hamish, I've just remembered something odd. About 3 weeks back, I saw Douglas Kerr in the village at the electronics shop talking to young Tom about mobile phones. Seemed strange at the time because Douglas already has a phone, doesn't he? Did you hear what they were discussing? Tom was explaining about pay-as-you-go phones, how they work without contracts. Douglas said something about getting one for his elderly aunt, someone who only needed it for emergencies and didn't want monthly bills. After hanging up, Hamish sat very still. Douglas helping elderly neighbours set up phones for Christmas, as he'd mentioned earlier. Or was it Douglas buying an untraceable phone for himself? He called the electronics shop in the village. Tom, the young man who ran it, confirmed that Douglas had asked about pay-as-you-go phones but hadn't purchased one there. Said he'd shop around for the best price. That was about 3 weeks ago, maybe a bit more. 3 weeks ago would have been late November, right around when the calls to Ewan Fraser had started. But the phone itself had been purchased in Inverness on November 15th, before Douglas's inquiry at the local shop. Hamish drove to Douglas's cottage, a neat stone building overlooking the water. Douglas answered the door, unsurprised to see him. "I thought you might come back. Would you like tea?" They sat in Douglas's tidy kitchen. Everything was in its place, clean and organised. A recipe book lay open on the counter to a page about mince pies. "I need to search your cottage, Douglas. Do you have a warrant? I can get one." Douglas considered this, then nodded. Go ahead. I've nothing to hide. Hamish searched methodically. The bedroom held nothing unusual, just clothes and books and photographs of Elizabeth, frozen young and smiling in happier times. The living room was equally unrevealing. The kitchen cupboards contained baking supplies and tinned goods, all neatly labelled. It was in the small shed behind the cottage that Hamish found what he was looking for. A box hidden beneath gardening supplies, containing a cheap voice changer device still in its packaging, a receipt from an Inverness shop dated November 14th, and a dark knit cap and scarf. But no mobile phone, no dark framed glasses like the ones in the security footage. Douglas appeared in the doorway of the shed. You won't find the phone. I destroyed it after Helen died. Threw the pieces into the loch, and the glasses were reading glasses from a charity shop, also in the loch now. So you admit you made the calls? I admit I made calls to Helen, yes. I wanted her to be frightened, to feel what Elizabeth felt. I wanted her to lie awake at night, wondering who was tormenting her, to experience even a fraction of the anxiety Elizabeth suffered. And the calls to Ewan Fraser? Douglas looked genuinely puzzled. I never called Ewan Fraser. Why would I? I barely know the man. Hamish studied him carefully. Douglas seemed to be telling the truth. But if he hadn't called Fraser, who had? Someone else with a grudge? Or had Fraser lied about the calls entirely? I need you to come to the station with me, Douglas. Am I under arrest? Not yet. But I need to take a formal statement about those calls. Harassment is a crime, even if you didn't physically harm anyone. As they walked back through the village, Douglas spoke quietly. I never meant to hurt her, you know. I just wanted her to feel afraid, to understand what it was like to be persecuted by someone with power over you. When I heard she'd died, I felt. He paused, searching for words. Not glad exactly. More like the book had finally closed. At the station, Hamish took Douglas's statement about the phone calls. But something still bothered him about the timeline, about the way Douglas had been so helpful from the beginning, pointing toward other suspects, being the first to find the body. Too helpful, perhaps, too convenient. As Douglas was leaving, Hamish asked one more question. What time exactly did you arrive at Helen's cottage on Christmas Eve? 9:15, as I told you before. And you're certain of that time? Douglas hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Yes, quite certain. But Hamish had seen that hesitation, that tiny crack in the facade of certainty. And he knew that Douglas Kerr was lying about something even if he couldn't yet prove what. Chapter 7. The Helpful Neighbour. Hamish spent that evening going through Douglas Kerr's life with the thoroughness of a man searching for a needle in a haystack who knows the needle is definitely there. He called the civil service department where Douglas had worked for 30 years, spoke to former colleagues, checked pension records and employment history. Everything came back clean. Douglas Kerr had been a model employee, punctual, reliable, with no black marks on his record. He'd retired at 65 with full benefits and a commendation for his years of dedicated service. But it was the personal history that interested Hamish more. He tracked down Elizabeth Kerr's sister, a woman named Margaret, living in Aberdeen, and called her late in the evening. Douglas? Margaret's voice carried a note of surprise. I haven't spoken to him in years. After Elizabeth died, he withdrew from everyone. Polite if you contacted him, but he never reached out himself. What was their marriage like? Happy, I always thought. Elizabeth adored him. She was the warm one, the one who drew people in. Douglas was quieter, more reserved, but he doted on her. When she died, it was like someone had switched off a light inside him. Did he ever express anger toward Helen Forbes? A long pause. At the funeral, he told me that Helen Forbes had murdered Elizabeth as surely as if she'd held the pillow over her face. Those were his exact words. It frightened me a bit, the cold way he said it. But then he never mentioned her again. I assumed he'd made his peace with it somehow. After the call, Hamish sat with lugs by the fire, turning over what he knew. Douglas had made the threatening calls, admitted as much. He'd been carrying grief and rage for 15 years, watching Helen Forbes live her life in the same village where his wife had died. But had that rage finally boiled over into violence? The next morning, Hamish drove to the Lockdub primary school again and asked to see the attendance records from 15 years ago. Mrs. Mackay looked puzzled but pulled the old ledgers from storage. "What are you looking for?" "I want to see which children were in Helen Forbes's class the year Elizabeth Kerr died." He found the register and ran his finger down the names. 23 pupils, including Jamie MacLeod, and there, halfway down the list, was a name that made him sit back in his chair. Thomas Kerr, Douglas and Elizabeth's son. "I didn't know the Kerrs had a child," Hamish said. Mrs. Mackay peered at the register. "Oh yes, Tommy. He'd be about 25 now, I suppose. Moved away after his mother died, went to live with relatives. I'd forgotten all about him." Hamish called Margaret in Aberdeen again. "Tommy? Yes, he came to live with us after Elizabeth passed. Douglas thought it would be better for the boy, a fresh start away from Lockdub. Tommy was only 10, devastated by his mother's death. We raised him as our own." "How is he now? Doing?" "Well, actually, he's a teacher himself down in Edinburgh. History, I think. He doesn't come back to the Highlands much. Too many painful memories." "Does he have contact with his father?" "Sporadic. They speak on the phone occasionally, exchange Christmas cards, but there's a distance between them, understandable given the circumstances. Douglas did what he thought was best for Tommy, but the boy always felt a bit abandoned by it." After hanging up, Hamish felt pieces clicking into place. Douglas had sent his son away, stayed in Lockdub alone, living in the village with the woman who had caused his wife's death. That took a particular kind of fortitude, or perhaps obsession. He called Douglas and asked him to come to the station again. "I'd like to talk about your son, Douglas." Douglas's face went still. "What about him?" "You sent him away after Elizabeth died." "I did what was best for the boy. He needed stability. A proper home with 2 parents. I couldn't give him that in my grief." "Did Tommy know that Helen Forbes was responsible for his mother's death?" "He knew Elizabeth had been falsely accused. He was 10 years old enough to understand what was happening. But I never told him explicitly that Helen had driven her to suicide. I didn't want him growing up with that burden of hatred." "When was the last time you saw him?" Douglas hesitated. "He came up for Christmas 2 years ago. We had dinner, talked about his teaching job. It was pleasant enough." "Just 2 years ago, not since? He's busy with his own life. I don't expect him to make the long journey regularly." Hamish let that sit for a moment. "Douglas, you've been very helpful throughout this investigation. Quick to point out other people who had grudges against Helen. Quick to provide context about village feuds. Almost as if you wanted to make sure I looked everywhere except at you." "I had nothing to hide. Except the threatening phone calls. Except your wife's suicide and your son's trauma. Except the fact that you've spent 15 years living in the same village as the woman you blame for your wife's death." Hamish leaned forward. "That takes tremendous self-control, Douglas. Or tremendous planning." Douglas met his gaze steadily. "Are you accusing me of murdering Helen Forbes?" "I'm saying you had more motive than anyone else, and I'm saying the timing of your arrival at her cottage, right after her death, is remarkably convenient. I've told you what happened. I brought mince pies, found her dead, called you immediately. What if you arrived earlier than you said? What if you called her first, knowing she was already nervous from your phone calls, and she invited you in or confronted you at the door? What if there was an argument, a struggle, and she fell?" Douglas's hands, resting on the table, were perfectly steady. "That's a very creative story, Constable, but it's just a story. You have no proof of any of it." And that was the problem. Hamish thought after Douglas left. He had motive, opportunity and circumstantial evidence, but no proof. No witnesses, no confession, nothing that would stand up in court. He walked down to the harbour where Archie McLean was working on his boat. "Archie, on Christmas Eve, did you see Douglas Kerr going to or from Helen Forbes's cottage?" Archie scratched his head. "Can't say I did, but I was inside most of the evening, it being so cold. The wife had me polishing silver for when her sister visited." "What time did you go out to check your boat?" "Must have been around 9. I always check her before bed. Make sure the moorings are secure. Saw a few folk heading to the pub, that's about all. Anyone walking near the waterfront cottages? Archie frowned, thinking. Now that you mention it, I did see Douglas. He was walking away from Helen's cottage, carrying that plate of mince pies. I called out a greeting and he seemed a bit startled. Said he'd just found Helen dead and was going to call you. What time was this exactly? 9:15, maybe 20 past. I remember because the church clock had just chimed the quarter hour, so Douglas had been at the cottage at the time he claimed. But Hamish's instincts told him something was still wrong with the timeline. He went back to the station and called to Dalrymple. Jennifer, you said Helen died between 8:30 and 9:30. Can you be more precise? Body temperature suggests closer to 9, give or take 10 minutes either way. So between 8:50 and 9:10 most likely. If Helen had died around 9 and Douglas had been seen at 9:15 carrying his mince pies, that gave him a very narrow window. But it was possible. Just barely possible. Hamish thought about the phone calls, the years of quiet rage, the helpful neighbour who knew everyone's secrets. He thought about the expression on Helen Forbes's face when she was found, that look of surprise. She had known her killer, had perhaps even let them in without hesitation. And who would Helen Forbes trust enough to let into her home late on Christmas Eve? Not Ewan Fraser, whose mother she'd destroyed. Not Ian MacLeod, whose son she'd falsely accused. Not Morag Sinclair, whom she'd publicly humiliated. But Douglas Kerr, the quiet widower who brought mince pies every Christmas Eve. Douglas, who had never openly confronted her, never made his anger known. She might have opened the door to him without a second thought. Hamish pulled out his notes on the threatening phone call saved on Helen's answering machine. You know what you did. He played it again on the tape he'd taken from her cottage, listening past the electronic distortion, and this time he heard it. A slight hesitation before the word did, a particular emphasis on you. The speech pattern of someone educated, someone who chose words carefully, someone like Douglas Kerr, retired civil service servant, who had spent 30 years writing precise reports in careful language. The pieces were falling into place. Now Hamish just needed Douglas to admit the truth, and he had an idea of how to make that happen. He picked up the phone and called Tommy Kerr in Edinburgh. It was time to bring the son home to face his father's secrets. Chapter 8. The Caller Revealed. Tommy Kerr arrived in Lochdoub late the following afternoon, a slender young man with his father's careful bearing and his mother's dark eyes. Hamish met him at the police station, where Tommy stood looking around as if seeing ghosts in every corner. I haven't been back here since I was 10, Tommy said quietly. I'd forgotten how small it is. Thank you for coming. I know it can't be easy. On the phone you said you had questions about my father and Helen Forbes. I suppose I've been expecting this call for 15 years. They sat down with tea, and Hamish studied the young man. Tommy had the same precise way of moving as his father, the same measured speech, but there was a softness to him that Douglas lacked, a vulnerability he hadn't yet learned to hide. Tell me about Christmas Eve, Hamish said. Did your father call you that day? Tommy looked surprised. Yes, actually. Around 7 in the evening. We don't usually speak that often, so it was a bit unexpected. He asked about my term at school, whether I was managing all right in Edinburgh. Small talk, really. How did he sound? Distracted, nervous maybe. I thought he might be feeling lonely, it being Christmas Eve. I offered to come up, but he said no, he had things to do. Mince pies to deliver, he said. Did he mention Helen Forbes? Tommy's face went still. Not by name, but he said something odd. He said, sometimes old debts come due, even after many years. When I asked what he meant, he changed the subject. Hamish made notes. Tommy, did you know your father blamed Helen Forbes for your mother's death? I pieced it together eventually. I was 10 when Mum died, but I wasn't stupid. I knew she had been accused of something at work, knew it had been proven false, knew she'd taken those pills because she couldn't bear the shame of it. Dad never spoke Helen Forbes's name in my presence, but I found out from my aunt years later who had made the accusations. How did you feel about that? Tommy was quiet for a long moment. Angry, confused, guilty that I'd left Dad alone with all that grief. But what could I do? I was a child, and then I was a teenager trying to build my own life. Dad seemed to want it that way, seemed to prefer his solitude. Did you ever confront Helen Forbes yourself? No, I thought about it sometimes, imagined what I'd say to her if I ever came back, but I never did. I suppose I took the coward's way out, just staying away from it all. After Tommy left to find a room at the Lochtub Hotel, Hamish sat alone with his thoughts. The phone call from Douglas to his son on Christmas Eve, the strange comment about old debts, the nervous distraction. It all suggested a man preparing to do something he'd been contemplating for a very long time. Hamish walked to Douglas's cottage as darkness fell. Douglas answered the door, unsurprised to see him. You spoke to Tommy? I did. I suppose you want to arrest me. Now? I want the truth, Douglas. All of it. They sat in Douglas's living room, the same room where he'd lived alone for 15 years with his grief and his rage. A photograph of Elizabeth smiled from the mantelpiece, forever young, forever unburdened by the knowledge of what her death had set in motion. Douglas was quiet for a long time staring at that photograph. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, almost relieved. I called her that evening. Used my regular phone, not the mobile. I'd been calling her for weeks with that distorted voice, watching her become more and more frightened, and I realized it wasn't enough. I needed her to know it was me, needed her to understand why. What time was this? 8:30. I told her I was the one who'd been calling, that I wanted to speak to her face to face about what she'd done to Elizabeth. She tried to hang up, but I said if she didn't let me come over, I'd stand outside her cottage and tell the whole village what she'd done. She agreed to let me in. And then I went to her cottage at 9:15. She opened the door, looking angry more than frightened. We stood in her hallway, and I told her everything, how Elizabeth had died because of her lies, how my son had grown up without his mother, how I'd spent 15 years watching her live her life without a shred of remorse. Douglas's hands were clasped tightly together, knuckles white. She said Elizabeth had been weak, that anyone with backbone would have fought the accusations instead of taking the easy way out. She said my wife's death was not her responsibility. What happened then? I grabbed her arm, not violently, just to make her listen, to make her stop saying those terrible things about Elizabeth. But Helen pulled away and started up the stairs, saying she was going to call the real police because clearly the village constable was incompetent. I followed her, still trying to explain and to make her understand. Douglas's voice cracked slightly. She turned on the stairs to tell me to get out of her house. I reached for her arm again, just to stop her from running away from the truth. She slapped at my hand, lost her balance. I grabbed for her, caught her throat for just a second, but she was already falling. She hit the stairs, tumbled down. I heard her neck break. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. I stood there for a minute, maybe longer, looking at her lying at the bottom of the stairs. She was dead, I could see that immediately. And I thought, this is it. This is what 15 years of grief and rage has brought me to. A dead woman on the floor and the rest of my life in prison. Why didn't you call for help? Because she was already dead and calling for help wouldn't change that. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went home, finished baking my mince pies as if nothing had happened, and came back at 9:15 to discover the body. I thought if I was the one to find her to call you, I'd be above suspicion, the helpful neighbour who just happened to arrive too late. But you couldn't resist pointing me toward other suspects. I thought I was being clever, Douglas said with a bitter smile. Giving you other people to investigate, other motives to consider. I even told myself I was doing you a favour, helping you understand Helen's history. But really I was just trying to save myself. Hamish looked at this quiet man who had carried such a burden for so long. You know I have to arrest you. I know, I've known since you started asking questions about Elizabeth. Part of me is relieved, actually. I've been living with this for days, pretending everything was normal. It's exhausting. Did you mean to kill her? Douglas met his eyes directly. No, I wanted her to admit what she'd done, to show some remorse, to acknowledge that Elizabeth's life had mattered. I wanted an apology, not revenge. But when she started up those stairs, when she dismissed Elizabeth's death as the act of a weak woman, something broke inside me. I reached for her, and she fell. Whether you call that murder or manslaughter or a tragic accident, I suppose that's for the courts to decide. And the phone calls to Ewan Fraser? Douglas looked genuinely confused. I never called Ewan Fraser. I told you that before, why would I? He had nothing to do with Elizabeth. So that remained a mystery, Hamish thought. Perhaps Fraser had lied about the calls, or perhaps someone else entirely had been tormenting him. Either way, it was separate from this case. I need to take you to Strathbane. Oh, Douglas. I know. May I have a moment? I'd like to call Tommy, tell him what's happened before he hears it from someone else. Hamish waited while Douglas made the call, speaking quietly to his son, his voice breaking only once. When he hung up, he stood and reached for his coat. Will you do something for me, Constable? If I can. Tell people Elizabeth was a good woman. Tell them Helen Forbes lied about her, that the accusations were false. My wife's name should be cleared, even if mine is going to be ruined. I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. They walked out into the cold night. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and silent, covering the village in white. As Hamish helped Douglas into the Land Rover, he saw lights on in the cottages along the shore. Families safe inside, unaware that their quiet, helpful neighbour had just confessed to killing Helen Forbes. It was a sad ending to a sad story, Hamish thought. No villains, really, just broken people making terrible choices in the wake of unforgivable cruelties. And Helen Forbes, lying cold in the mortuary, had finally paid for the lives she'd destroyed with her lies. Chapter 9. A Quiet Admission. The interview room at Strathbane Police Station was painted an institutional green that did nothing to improve anyone's mood. Douglas Kerr sat across from Hamish with Detective Chief Inspector Blair looming in the corner, for once keeping his mouth shut as the formal statement was taken. Douglas repeated his story with the same measured precision he'd shown at his cottage, leaving nothing out. The weeks of planning, the purchase of the voice changer in Inverness, the phone calls designed to fray Helen's nerves, and finally the confrontation that had ended in her death. But you maintain it was an accident, Blair said, speaking for the first time. His tone suggested deep skepticism. I maintain that I never intended to kill her, Douglas corrected. I wanted her frightened, wanted her to feel hunted the way Elizabeth felt hunted by those false accusations. When I went to her cottage that night, I wanted a confession, an apology, some acknowledgement of the harm she'd done. What happened on those stairs was not planned. But you did grab her. I grabbed her arm to stop her from walking away from me, from dismissing my wife's death as meaningless. Yes, I did that. And when she pulled away and started up the stairs, I followed her. I reached for her again, caught her throat briefly as she turned. She lost her balance and fell. Douglas's voice remained steady. I accept responsibility for her death, but I did not go there intending murder. After the formal statement was signed, Blair left to speak with the Procurator Fiscal about charges. Hamish remained with Douglas in the interview room. Your son's here, Hamish said. Would you like to see him? Does he want to see me? He's been waiting for 2 hours. I'd say that answers your question. Tommy Kerr was brought in, and Hamish gave them privacy, stepping outside but remaining close enough to intervene if needed. Through the small window in the door, he watched father and son sit across from each other, not touching, but the emotion between them was palpable even from a distance. When Hamish returned 20 minutes later, Tommy's eyes were red, but his expression was calmer. Thank you for letting us talk, Douglas said. I hadn't realised how much I needed to see him. He's arranged a solicitor for you. A good one from Edinburgh. Comes recommended. Douglas nodded, then looked at Hamish directly. You'll keep your promise about clearing Elizabeth's name. I will. The records will show Helen Forbes falsified the complaint against your wife. Mrs. Mackay at the school has agreed to issue a formal statement acknowledging the injustice. Thank you. That matters more than you might think. After Douglas was taken to a cell to await his bail hearing, Hamish drove back to Loch Dubh through the darkness. The village looked peaceful under its blanket of snow, lights twinkling in cottage windows, smoke rising from chimneys into the still air. He found Jimmy Anderson waiting at the police station with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. Thought you might need this, Jimmy said, pouring generous measures. It's not every day you arrest someone for killing a woman who probably deserved worse than she got. No one deserves to die at the bottom of their stairs, Jimmy. Aye. Well, but Helen Forbes destroyed lives for sport, near as I can tell. How many others like Elizabeth Kerr are out there? People whose reputation she ruined for no good reason. Hamish had been thinking the same thing. He'd found 4 falsified records in Helen's files, 4 children wrongly accused and expelled. How many more had there been over 35 years of teaching? How many parents had been humiliated? How many families damaged? Douglas Kerr will likely get manslaughter, Jimmy said. The fiscal's already talking about diminished responsibility, years of grief and provocation. He'll serve time, but probably not as much as you'd think. That doesn't make it right. No. But it makes it human. After Jimmy left, Hamish sat with lugs by the fire and thought about justice, about the difference between legal punishment and moral culpability. Douglas had killed Helen Forbes. There was no question of that. But Helen had killed Elizabeth Kerr as surely as if she'd handed her the bottle of pills, and she'd never been held accountable. The next morning, Hamish called a meeting at the village hall. Word had spread quickly about Douglas's arrest, and rumours were flying faster than midges in summer. He wanted to set the record straight before gossip turned truth into something unrecognisable. The hall was packed. Mrs. Wellington sat in the front row, her formidable presence dominating the space. Jessie Curry perched on the edge of her seat, ready to repeat everything twice to anyone who would listen. Archie McLean stood at the back with several other fishermen. Even the laird, Colonel Halbert and Sir Saupen Smythe, had come down from his estate. Hamish stood before them and explained as much as he could without compromising the case. Helen Forbes had falsely accused Elizabeth Kerr of misconduct 15 years ago. The accusations had been proven false, but Elizabeth had taken her own life before that vindication came. Douglas Kerr had harboured grief and anger for those 15 years, and on Christmas Eve, that anger had led to a confrontation that ended in Helen's death. Douglas Kerr is not a murderer in the way we usually think of murderers, Hamish said carefully. He's a man who carried a terrible loss for 15 years and finally cracked under the weight of it. That doesn't excuse what happened, but I wanted you all to understand the context. What about Helen Forbes? Well, Mrs. Wellington asked. Are we to pretend she was blameless in all this? No one was blameless, Mrs. Wellington. Helen Forbes used her position to harm people, to falsify records, to destroy reputations. We've found evidence of at least 4 other cases where she manipulated documentation to support false accusations. Those records will be corrected, and the people involved will be notified. Ian MacLeod stood up, his face working with emotion. My Jamie, you're saying she really did lie about him? Yes, Mr. MacLeod. The confession she claimed he made was added to his file after the fact, possibly forged. Your son was wrongly expelled. The murmur that ran through the hall was part anger, part vindication, part sorrow for years lost to false accusations. What happens now? Priscilla asked from her seat near the front. Douglas will face charges. He'll have his day in court. Beyond that, we try to repair what damage we can and remember that words, whether spoken or written, have consequences that can echo for decades. After the meeting, people clustered in small groups, talking in low voices. Hamish noticed that the conversation had shifted from Douglas's crime to Helen's cruelties. Public opinion was already forming, and it was not sympathetic to the victim. He walked back to the police station to find Dr. Dalrymple waiting on his doorstep. I wanted you to know, she said. "I've been going through Helen's medical records. She had early-stage dementia diagnosed 6 months ago. She'd been refusing treatment, insisting she was fine. Does that change anything? Only that she might not have been fully responsible for her actions in recent months. The paranoia, the rigidity, the inability to acknowledge her mistakes, those can all be symptoms." Hamish absorbed this new information. It didn't excuse what Helen had done 15 years ago, when her mind had been sound, but it perhaps explained why she'd been so particularly harsh in her final confrontation with Douglas, why she'd been unable to show any compassion or remorse. Should I tell Douglas? Jennifer considered this. I don't know. Will it make it easier for him to live with what he's done, or harder? I'll leave that to his solicitor to decide. That evening Hamish walked to the church where Reverend McPhee was preparing for evening prayers. The minister looked up from his hymnal as Hamish entered. "A sad business, Hamish. Poor Douglas. Poor Helen, for that matter, twisted up in her own righteousness until she couldn't see the damage she caused. Do you think he'll be forgiven? By God, by the village, by himself?" McPhee set down his hymnal. "By God, certainly, if he seeks forgiveness. By the village, probably, given time and understanding. By himself? That's the hardest forgiveness of all to earn. Douglas Kerr will carry this for the rest of his days, no matter what sentence the court imposes." Hamish sat in the quiet church, thinking about forgiveness and justice, about the weight of old sins and the cost of delayed reckoning. Outside, evening was falling over Lochdub, another day drawing to a close in the endless cycle of Highland life. Tomorrow Douglas would appear before the sheriff for his bail hearing. Tommy would stand by his father, perhaps beginning to repair the relationship broken by grief and distance, and Hamish would write his reports, filling in all the official forms that transformed human tragedy into bureaucratic record. But tonight, he simply sat in the peace of the church and let the silence settle around him, a brief respite before the machinery of justice began its inexorable work. Chapter 10, Bells at Midnight. 3 days after Douglas Kerr's arrest, Hamish stood in his kitchen, making breakfast for himself and Lugs when the phone rang. It was the Procurator Fiscal's office in Strathbane. "Constable Macbeth, Douglas Kerr has been charged with culpable homicide. His solicitor has entered a plea of not guilty. Though we expect that will change to guilty with mitigating circumstances once we reach court. He's been granted bail." After hanging up, Hamish felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Culpable homicide rather than murder meant the fiscal had accepted that Douglas hadn't intended to kill Helen Forbes. It was the right charge, though it wouldn't bring much comfort to Douglas himself. He spent the morning finishing his reports, the tedious paperwork that transformed a village tragedy into official documentation. Blair had called twice already, trying to take credit for solving the case, conveniently forgetting that he had done nothing but drink Hamish's whiskey and complain about Highland incompetence. Around midday, Tommy Kerr appeared at the police station door. "My father wanted me to thank you," Tommy said. "He said you were fair, that you didn't make it worse than it needed to be." "How is he?" "Shaken, relieved in a strange way. He's staying with his sister in Aberdeen until the trial. The solicitor thinks he'll get 3 to 5 years, probably serve 2 with good behaviour." "And you?" Tommy managed a small smile. "I'm going back to Edinburgh tomorrow, but I'll visit him regularly now. We talked properly for the first time in years, about Mum, about what happened, about all the things we should have said 15 years ago. It's not a happy ending exactly, but it's something." After Tommy left, Hamish walked down to Curry's stores where Jessie was holding court behind the counter, surrounded by customers eager for the latest details. Poor Douglas, she was saying as Hamish entered on. To carry such grief for so long, and Helen Forbes, well, we all knew she had a sharp tongue, but to falsify records, to destroy lives. "Jessie," Hamish interrupted gently, "perhaps we should let the past rest now." Of course, Jessie agreed, though her eyes gleamed with the knowledge that this story would fuel village gossip for months to come. That afternoon, Hamish drove to the school where Mrs. Mackay was preparing letters to the families of children Helen had falsely accused. Jamie MacLeod would receive official acknowledgement of his innocence. 3 other families would learn their children had been wrongly expelled or transferred, their records permanently stained by a teacher's lies. "It's the least we can do," Mrs. Mackay said, signing the letters with a troubled expression. "Though it can't undo the damage, can't give those children back their lost opportunities." "No," Hamish agreed. "But the truth matters, even when it comes late." As evening approached, Hamish found himself drawn to Helen Forbes's cottage. The door was locked now, the windows dark. Soon her estate would be settled, the cottage cleaned out and sold. Another family would move in, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded there on Christmas Eve. He thought about Helen, brilliant and exacting, who had wielded her intelligence like a weapon. What had made her that way? A difficult childhood? Professional disappointments? Or simply a fundamental lack of empathy, an inability to see beyond her own rigid standards? Dr. Dalrymple had mentioned dementia, which might have made her final months more paranoid and inflexible than usual. But the damage she'd done to Elizabeth Kerr and others had happened when her mind was sound. There was no excuse for that, no medical explanation that made it forgivable. And yet, standing outside her dark cottage, Hamish felt a measure of pity for her. She had died alone, unloved, with only enemies to remember her. What a waste of a life that could have been spent teaching with kindness rather than cruelty. On New Year's Eve, a week after Helen's death, Hamish attended the traditional gathering at the Loch Dubh Hotel. The village had decided to mark the new year with something approaching normalcy, though the shadow of recent events hung over the festivities. Douglas's absence was notable. His usual spot at the bar remained empty, a silent reminder of what had been lost. But the villagers were Highland people, practical and resilient, and life went on even in the wake of tragedy. Archie MacLean raised a glass, to absent friends and to truths finally told. The toast was drunk with more solemnity than usual. Later, as midnight approached, Hamish stood outside the hotel with Priscilla. The sky was clear, stars brilliant in the winter darkness, and the air was so cold it burned the lungs. "Do you think the village will forgive him?" Priscilla asked. "Douglas, I mean." "I think they already have in their way. They understand grief, understand what it means to carry a loss that never quite heals, and they knew Helen Forbes well enough to understand what drove him to it." "That's not exactly justice, though, is it?" "No," Hamish admitted, "but it's something closer to mercy, which might be better." The church bells began to ring, marking the arrival of the new year. Around them, villagers called out greetings and good wishes, the annual ritual of hope renewed. Hamish thought about the year just ended, about Christmas Eve and the phone call that had shattered the quiet, about Helen Forbes lying at the bottom of her stairs, about Douglas Kerr's 15 years of silent grief finally erupting into violence, about Elizabeth Kerr whose death had set everything in motion. Words, he reflected, could be as deadly as any weapon. Helen's false accusations had killed Elizabeth as surely as poison. Douglas's angry words on Christmas Eve had preceded the struggle that killed Helen, and now more words, spoken in courtrooms and written in reports, would determine Douglas's fate. "You're very quiet," Priscilla observed. "Just thinking about the case, about how much damage we do to each other, sometimes without even realising it. And sometimes realising it perfectly well," Priscilla added. "Helen Forbes knew what she was doing when she filed those false reports." "Aye, she did." They stood in companionable silence as the bells continued to ring. Around them the village celebrated, determined to leave the old year's troubles behind and embrace whatever the new year might bring. Hamish knew he would think about this case for a long time, not because it was particularly complex, but because it illustrated something fundamental about human nature. The capacity for cruelty, yes, but also the capacity for endurance. Douglas had endured 15 years before breaking. How many others carried similar griefs, nursing similar wounds, holding on by threads that might snap at any moment? The bells fell silent and the villagers began to disperse, heading home through the snow. Hamish walked back to the police station with Lugs trotting beside him, the dog's breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Inside, the fire had burned low. Hamish added peat and settled into his chair, Lugs immediately claiming the warm spot at his feet. Tomorrow there would be more paperwork, more reports to file, more bureaucratic matters to handle. Blair would continue to take credit for solving the case. The newspapers would probably describe it as a tragic accident rather than the complicated truth it was. But tonight, Hamish allowed himself simply to sit and be grateful. Grateful for his peaceful village, his comfortable station, his loyal dog. Grateful that most mysteries were simpler than this one, most crimes less tragic. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering Loch Dubh in a fresh layer of white. A new year had begun, bringing with it the promise of renewal and the burden of memory. Hamish had solved the case, had found the truth and brought it to light. Justice would be served after its own fashion. Elizabeth Kerr's name would be cleared. Douglas Kerr would pay for his crime, but perhaps not more than he could bear. And Helen Forbes would be remembered not as she might have wished, as a devoted teacher who maintained high standards, but as a cautionary tale about the abuse of power and the consequences of cruelty. As Hamish drifted off to sleep in his chair, the church bells rang one final time, a single clear note that echoed across the water and faded into the Highland night. Even on Christmas Eve, justice had its own time to arrive, and in Loch Dubh, as in all small places where people lived in close quarters with old memories and older grudges, the truth always came out eventually. It just sometimes took 15 years and a terrible price to get there.